Alrighty, continuing on in our Being a Better DM series, we are going to cover rule number 1, the golden rule number 1. Know your players and understand trust. This is the golden rule because everything that you do is going to be related to what your players' expectations are, what your expectations are, and your ability to work together. In role-playing games in general, it's not that the DM is doing a service for the players. It's not like he's kind of a book on tape individual lecturing to the students, so to speak. You're both on equal footing in this, and the dungeon master should be having as good of a time as the players. And both sides of that have a responsibility to make sure that everybody's having a good time. It's not about just making the players have a good time. If you're not having a good time, it's going to show. It's going to come through. And we want to make sure that we understand where everybody is, who's on first, what's on second, and I don't know is on third, and make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page. And rule number 1 always comes back to this. Regardless of what your philosophies are on how to run a campaign or how to play the game the way that you see fit, if you want to use miniatures and your players want to use miniatures, okay, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no right or wrong answer to how to play these games. But what you really need to do is make sure that you are aware of what your players' expectations are to start with. And that's what we're going to kind of gear. And the first thing we want to know is, who are you playing with? It's a very different experience to be playing with 5 people who are in their 30s doing a game of Dungeons and Dragons, and playing with 5 people who are 12. And what if you're the 30-year-old DM playing with your nephews who happen to be 10 or 11 or 12? Or what if you're the 12-year-old DM and you're playing with 3 of your friends and maybe your uncle? What you need to understand with your players, and especially when you're starting out, it's easier to do this when you're starting out, especially like if you're 10 or 11 and your friends have never played a role-playing game either. You all can you're on the same page and you're inexperienced, and you really kind of have an idea of what you want to do. High fantasy, you want to be kind of a pen and paper version of a Final Fantasy game that you're fond of, or Dragon Quest for that matter. Or are you looking for something a little bit more cerebral and intellectual? Or do you just want to, be super awesome sword-wielding badasses that go and fight giant monstrous hordes of monsters just because that sounds like a really cool idea? It's called Dungeons and Dragons for a reason. So there is an element of that kind of glory in combat kind of a thing. But again, despite its reputation, which I still am befuddled by when it comes to churches, is that role-playing games are also a great way to explore the idea of good versus evil and what are the moral and ethical dilemmas that come across. And you get that with older players a lot of times, where moral and ethical issues are easily explored, and you can do very, I would use the term almost caricature-like examples of that. You can have really blatant moral and ethical choices, and then you can kind of see how that plays out. But another thing is what kind of character classes, professions, and the type of races that people are interested in. You've got your standard dwarves and elves and humans and things like that. I tend to avoid those at all cost. And especially with the more modern rule sets, it's very easy to play a goblin or a kobold or a bugbear or if you're Dragonlance, I think it was the draconian Baz, and there's a wealth of creatures in the monster manual that could easily be a character that and a race that they want to try to play. And it's a good idea to get familiar with what their options are that they're thinking of, because we'll cover this at a later one when we get to planning, but we're actually going to write the campaign after they've picked their characters and races. And the reason we do that is so we can tailor the adventure to what they've chosen to play. If they all want to be a bunch of clerics, then they should be able to be a bunch of clerics. If they want to be all fighters, they should be all fighters. You should never have an adventure or a campaign where well, we need one tank, we need one healer, we need one DPSer, and we need a rogue to open locks. And no, they should be free to play whatever class they want based on the mechanics of your system, and be free to have a wide variety of choices and races. They don't have to have unlimited choices. In fact, in my campaigns, I have a no human, no elf policy. You cannot be human, you cannot be elf. You can be anything else, but not those two. There's a story reason for that, but we'll get into that later when it comes to world building. Another thing is, especially with Dungeons & Dragons, what alignment are they thinking of? And alignments are kind of your ethical standards. Dungeons & Dragons is best known for good, neutral, evil, and then lawful, neutral, and chaos. And the idea is you want your party to be able to get along, especially when you're starting out. The older you get, it's a little easier, especially after when you start getting into your 30s, it's a lot easier to have a party that has disparate alignments, like somebody's lawful evil and another person's chaotic good. When you have a lot of more life experience and maturity to that degree, you understand how you can work with people that you don't necessarily would get along with. When you're younger, it's a lot easier just to get everybody on the same page, at least when it comes to good, neutral, or evil. The methods, you can have somebody who's lawful good, which is, right as rain, Superman type, or you could have somebody who's chaotic good, which is more like a Batman, and you can see where they can function and get along. The problem is when you start getting people who are lawful evil, let's say like a more contemporary Lex Luthor type individual, and somebody who is chaotic good like the Green Arrow. You're not going to really see those two team up. And that causes a lot of problems, like when the Paladin in the group casts Detect Evil and it's the guy standing right next to him. It's easier to kind of avoid that initially. With an older group, you can kind of take chances with that, but getting that idea, because it sets the theme of your campaign. If they all want to be evil and be the villains, that's going to drastically change how you write and plan your adventures and your campaigns versus if they're all lawful good. And if you want to throw in moral dilemmas, the brilliant thing is okay, if they're all lawful good and they're in a kingdom where slavery is legal and the slave is demanding that they rescue the slave, well, that's an interesting moral dilemma because it's the law in that place. It's perfectly legal. So what does a lawful good person do in that situation? That's an opportunity. I kid you not, if you want to have a good time, get to your local church and have your pastor DM. You can explore a lot of religious themes and philosophical themes and political themes through role-playing games and not step on any toes. So it's just a mechanic in order to have fun with that. I never really could understand some groups' dislike of that. I mean, in the old days, it was understandable when you had the demigods and deities books and things like that where that could be misinterpreted. But so having an idea of what their kind of moral background is going to be for their characters is important. Another thing with the players is know what their schedules are like. When you're young, it's extremely easy to play 30 sessions when you're still in school. Everybody shows up maybe Friday night or Saturday, for a couple hours. And when you're young, it's easier. When you're older, it's damn near impossible. I've tried playing with some of my friends, and we're all married, and there's kids, and it's just, we might be able to get 8 or 9 game sessions a year. And if you have a campaign that you've planned 30 adventures in, you're looking at 5 years to play through that. So you really have to kind of understand what their schedules are and plan accordingly. It's much easier as an adult for everybody to meet up for like a long weekend for 3 days and just play for 3 days a couple times a year, rather than trying to do every Friday night or every Saturday night and things like that. And you want to keep your core group of people consistent because it's hard to swap people in and out. If you're playing with 5 people, you want all 5 people there each time. There are a couple techniques that you can use to get around that. Have 3 people that can commit to be there every time, and then have 2 other slots for people to swap in and out of. And the idea is they're kind of the support people that might be elsewhere. And then you introduce them and bring them in and out as necessary. Quick, ride back to town and see. And then we can determine if they made it back to town, i.e. they weren't able to show that night. And then when they come back, we can kind of feed in what happened when they went back to town. And if they are able to make it the other night, something may have prevented them from leaving for town, and they came back and said, yeah, there's a giant minotaur outside, or something to that extent. So there are techniques that you can use to do that. How much time they can commit, it's, again, as I said earlier, if you plan something to be 30 minutes long, it's going to be an hour and a half plus 5 minutes. How long do you play for? When I was playing in DMing, we'd play for 4 hours a shot. Now that we're older, sometimes we play 12 hours when we actually get around to it, because we do all day, because that's what we can schedule and budget for time. How much time they can commit is extremely important, coupled with schedule, because that's how long you have to try to build your adventure. When you're using miniatures, it's extremely difficult to just pick up and stop. We can play till 8 o'clock or 8:30, and the younger kids know about this. When 8:30 hits, it's time to go back home. Okay, well, if there's miniatures, you got to remember where everything is supposed to be, and you got to, plan this and plan that, and when you come back the next session, you got to kind of piece it all together. I detest miniatures. It's very easy when you don't use miniatures to just stop with the techniques that I'll explain as we go through this. You say, okay, we're on round 6. We'll be back here next Thursday. We'll pick up right where we left off. It's easy. But when you start getting miniatures and things involved, it becomes extremely difficult. So plan your adventures based on the amount of time that you think you're going to have. And again, always triple that time and add 5 minutes. So next one, which we touched on earlier in the broader summary, is how much detail do they need or want? It's a good way is... there's a test that I use, and it's had plenty of different names and plenty of different interpretations, but I'll give you this test. And the idea is there's a city, let's say it's in the desert, in a box canyon, and there's a big western wall that's 90 feet tall that keeps the desert sands out, and in the center of the town is a market, and in an alley is a door to a magic shop of curiosities and knickknacks and things of that nature. But to the initiated, the woman that runs it is actually a powerful wizard and has many powerful trinkets and information for sale. The door to her shop is made of wood and it has a glass dragon. Okay, that's all you need to give them. Tell them to draw the door. You should get, if you have 5 players, 5 very different looking doors. Because all we told them is made out of wood and it had a glass dragon in it. We didn't say if it was 1 piece of glass or 50 pieces of glass, or is the door mostly glass. We give them a little bit of detail and we see what they come up with. And you want to kind of gauge how much imagination they have. The more vivid someone's imagination, the less details you'll need to give them. My problem with the 2 newest generations is that they don't know where to begin with the door. The last time I did this test up at a comic book store called The Source, they asked me like 50 questions. 50. How tall is the door? What kind of wood is the door made out of? How big is the dragon? Is it all 1 piece? I mean, they would literally... I'm telling you. Imagination bankruptcy, real issue. Just give me the fucking door with a dragon in it. That's all. And if they have a very healthy imagination, you should get 5 very different looking doors. They don't have to be good artists by all means. And it's actually an art exercise that a lot of people do. One of the most famous ones I ever saw was one that kind of ran through DeviantArt for a while, is Pepper. Pictures of Pepper. And people are like, who's Pepper? Pepper is a spy. Pepper has red hair. That's it. Those 2 lines are the only details the artists got. Draw Pepper. And you would be amazed at the difference in the art that came out of that little experiment. We had pictures of just a headshot, a bust. We had entire action scenes. We had Pepper with a mohawk, Pepper with a ponytail, Pepper with like a kind of a Rutger Hauer Blade Runner style haircut. That is a sign of a good, healthy imagination, and you get that in a lot of artists and art sites. The problem is the vast majority of people, if you were to tell them Pepper has red hair and Pepper is a spy, they wouldn't know where to begin. So it's very important to kind of gauge how much detail they're going to need and want. And we're going to talk about here in the next couple slides here about the pre-game session, but it's kind of an opportunity to kind of figure out how much information and detail and how much control they want to have. A lot of times, starting out, they're going to roll their attack dice, and I'm going to use my longsword and attack one of the orcs. Okay. Some players will want to be in a position to tell the story of that attack on their own. Okay, so you roll, you hit, how much damage? You roll the dice, I did 7 damage. Okay, it's a pretty good solid hit. So either the DM as the narrator can explain what just happened, or the player might want to have the opportunity to explain what just happened. And you can say, you hit him pretty good, he's pretty injured and hurt, why don't you tell us how that came about? And then he can kind of narrate his own character's actions. A lot of times it works a lot better just to let the DM do it. It's a little bit more entertaining in my experience for the players to have the DM explain to them just how badass their character pulled this off, because you can take a lot of creative liberty then. You can make their characters be as heroic as the player wants them to be. So it just depends. Yeah, my coffee's getting cold. All right, so next couple bullets here are how important are various features of the system to the players. And this goes into things like miniatures and maps and how often they want combat and how important is the story and things of that nature. And it is important, and your gaming system will influence that. D&D, because of its lineage with chainmail, is very much influenced by miniatures. Games like the Palladium systems, like for Ninjas and Super Spies and Heroes Unlimited and Robotech, they're not very miniature driven, because quite frankly the thought of piloting a Veritech against 15 officer pods, 226 female power armors, and 1,000 or so battle pods in a giant space battle that they're involved in, I really don't like the idea of having to try to play that out with miniatures. So, and Rifts, as popular as Rift was at one point, they really never actually got around to making a lot of miniatures for it. And again, because of the breadth of the monsters and the creatures and the lore of that world, miniatures would have been pretty difficult. I mean, a Splugorth slave barge with a bunch of slave girls on it would have been a nightmare to paint, let alone just deal with. So, but a lot of players, especially younger players, might need more visual feedback. They might want to have all those online tools and maps and things like that. I tend to explain that gets in the way. It's very difficult to build a mood or a sense of suspense in the players if they have a map in front of them that kind of shows more than you really would want them to know. Because it's almost like having a mini map in your brain, and you really don't have that. And a lot of people have gotten used to that, but it's very easy to get lost in something like a library that you've never been in, because you can't see all the doors and the exits. But if you have a map, you always have kind of a reference point. And because of that, it's very hard to build the sense of claustrophobia or being lost if they can just look at the map every time. So if they want to make their own map, that's one thing. And a lot of times as a DM, you'll have a map of your own and where you will keep kind of track of where they are. But it's not necessary to show the players that. If they want to make their own map, then you probably need to have a map ready. I just tend to kind of, again, like a bullet point list the features of a particular dungeon, not really the specific layout. And if they are going to map it, I just let them know that they know the way to those particular points. So you know the way back to where you came in. You know the way back to that, to the room that had the caskets and things of that nature. The interconnecting corridors and stuff like that, it just really isn't all that important. So that's one way of looking at it, is that even if you're going to use a map, it's not necessary to supply the players with that map. And if they're going to, if their characters are going to map as they go along, you don't really need to have them worrying about drawing an actual specific map. Now, there is a certain amount of joy in that. And if your players want that, you should be willing to provide that. But again, by and large, I found that it tends to be more distracting than helpful. The last bullet point is kind of obvious, but a lot of times, especially with older DMs, we tend to forget things, is that how old are your players? Having a 10-year-old player mixed in with a group of 20-somethings, it's perfectly fine, but a lot of context and subtle, especially emotional or philosophical issues can go flying clear over their head. It's fun sometimes to take younger players and put them in a situation where their characters are older than them and see how they try to act older. It's also interesting to go the opposite direction. When you've got a bunch of 35-year-olds sitting around and their characters are 14 or 15, it's interesting to see how they play that out. But you need to know how emotionally mature and what the life experiences are of your players, so they have the tools necessary to bring those characters to life. I see this time and time again, is that if you have a male player playing a female character, they tend to make a caricature out of the cross-gender character, and which can be fun, especially if it's a more lighthearted campaign, but you have to be aware of those kind of issues that might crop up. Cross-gender role-playing, it's very common. When I played World of Warcraft, most of my characters were female, largely because I didn't want to stare at a guy's ass all day. I'm playing a game where the camera's behind someone. Do I really want to spend 8 hours looking at some dude's ass or a woman's ass? As my wife would point out, I hope most of my characters are female because she doesn't want me looking at some dude's ass all day. That makes her nervous. I don't know why. Probably because I also do interior decorating on the side and painting. She's worried about my ability to coordinate a throw pillow a little too much. I don't know. So it's important to understand the age group and make sure that you're aware of it. You don't have to necessarily make it age appropriate, but you need to understand how that's going to play out. So how do we understand our players? I am a firm believer in what I call the pre-campaign session. This is where you bring the players maybe a couple weeks beforehand together. You roll your characters. You kind of go over the RPG system. You have house rules maybe. Have a plan for when the rules aren't clear. So ahead of time, everybody knows, okay, what if we don't know how to handle something? We'll roll a d20, higher than 10, lower than 10. Be done with it. That kind of stuff. Have them, if they've never played a role-playing game, walk through some basic concepts. Okay, now you have your character. Let's do a combat. And I like to call them the Scrabble board combat. You just grab something like a chessboard or Scrabble board or something like that, and you just kind of go over how the mechanics of the game kind of work. Just no experience, no loss, no nothing. Just kind of a generic random encounter that's just used for teaching purposes. And it's important to do that, especially when you're all figuring it out, because you need to understand how certain things happen. And role-playing games are relatively simple. They basically have just a few ingredients. One is, when you want to do something, how do you check against it? So a difficulty check. Every role-playing game system has some form of difficulty check. In modern D&D, it's actually abbreviated difficulty check, DC. If it's DC 10, you have to pick up a D20. Let's say it involves strength. You have a bonus on your strength, roll the D20, add that bonus, and then if it's higher than the difficulty, it succeeds. If it's a difficulty that roughly involves agility, then you would use dexterity's bonus and roll over the difficulty. This is a little different in games like White Wolf and some other role-playing game systems that have what we call partial successes. You could say, I'm going to lift the rock. Well, if you get 3 successes, you lift it and move it out of the way. If you get 2 successes, you're able to make a gap just big enough to crawl through. 1 success, you're able to lift it just enough where you could slip something underneath, but you're not able to lift it. And then explain to the players what the DM does versus what the players are supposed to do. And you can use these videos as a kind of a guide to help them understand that. But basically, they need to understand what the DM's job is. And he's not the enemy, he's not the adversary, he is the guy that has to help the players resolve what's happening to them. He's not the enemy, he's neutral in this. But more importantly, he is a person who is trying to entertain the players. The players should also be trying to entertain the DM. And that give and take relationship, once they understand that, then they realize that they have a part to play in building this adventure. It's not the DM does all the work and the players get to enjoy it. The players have just as much work to do. And they really need to understand that they're balanced in that regard. The DM has set up all of the framework. It's up to the players to decorate it, if you would. So understand that and then set expectations for your players. And this goes back to understanding your players, is that they should understand that they have stuff to do. They have stuff to contribute. They have these things that they should have to do. Character backgrounds, character conversations is difficult. And there's a whole philosophy on out-of-character talking versus in-character talking. And that's a little bit something that you just develop over time. I really can't go over it very well because it's a very abstract thought. You have 5 people sitting around during game time. Do you want them to all be talking in character? So if your friend Bill is playing Yosen the wizard, Yosen should be the one talking and interacting with all of the other people around the table in character. Kind of like if you had Johnny Depp sitting at a bar, in character would be him being Jack Sparrow versus out of character is Johnny Depp being Johnny Depp. And the ratios, a lot of DMs are like, keep OCC to a minimum. Some of them don't care at all. I don't give a shit. The problem I have with that is that when you try to pretend to be your character and you try to pretend to do that dialogue, again, as I point out, every detail that you give the players is one less that they can imagine on their own. When you try to recreate conversations verbatim, you lose the ability and the freedom for the people to envision in their own head what your character sounds like and how your character would talk and how their character and your character interact. You have some input on that, but it's much more interesting to leave that to everybody's respective imaginations. If you say that your character speaks with a southern drawl, don't try to talk with the southern drawl. Just let them keep that in their head and have them in their own imagination fill that in, because especially when in high fantasy environments, we have no idea what a particular dwarven language may actually sound like, depending on the circumstances. So another thing which comes out of work as well, but if you don't set expectations, people can't exceed them. And people, by and large, enjoy having a finish line or a checkpoint that they can reach and have a point of success. You cannot exceed expectations if you don't set any, but more importantly, without expectations and goals, you can never succeed. You can never achieve something if there's nothing to be achieved. So have that understanding that, listen, you guys need to bring these characters to life. Do your best to do that, and that's how you're going to get extra experience and and things of that nature to move your character forward. And reward good role playing, but don't punish bad role playing. There's never a reason to deduct things because people aren't a very good actor. But if they're really contributing to the campaign, they should be rewarded in an appropriate fashion, and that will again depend on the players. But I've played campaigns where somebody made an entire, I think it was 2.5 feet by 3 feet, big rectangle map of the game world. And I never gave them a map. They just pieced all of the information that I had given them, and they made this very lovely map for me. Unfortunately, that went up in a fire when the house on Geneva went up, but that's where most of my role-playing stuff actually got cooked. But there was a lot of opportunities for players to contribute to the world. And the beauty of it is when you complete a campaign, it doesn't mean that world needs to go away. You could fast forward the timeline 100 years and pick up in the same world, have all the same maps and things that the players have contributed, and they can see that stuff come back and come full circle. So, player homework. During that pre-campaign session that I suggested, one way to help get to know your characters as well as the players is have them write up a page backstory of their character after the pregame session. Give yourself at least 2 weeks between the pregame session and when you actually start your campaign, and have the group of them, the 5 of them or however many they are, completely independent from you, submit a page backstory on how they all met. And you're like, well, I wanted to introduce them. I've learned over many a campaign and many adventure, it is much better to let the players explain how they met rather than have the DM do it. It gives them more freedom and more control to really set the personality, tone, and pacing of it. You give them enough information about the game world and the campaign world where they can kind of write the story up. You can revise it once they've submitted it to you, and then you can read it back to them. But give them that opportunity to say, yeah, well, we all got into a big bar fight at the end, and we got thrown in the dungeon for a couple months, and we met in the dungeon. Surprising the DM is a good thing. You should, as a DM, want to be surprised by your players and want to see the game that you've put out, the campaign that you've grow bigger than what you designed it to be. And that's going to come out of the players' contributions to the story. So it's a very effective solution on giving them a sense of freedom and letting them build their group. You always assume that they're, quote, loyal to one another to a degree, where they can depend on each other at the very least. So let them know that that's your expectation. Hey, you guys get along. I don't care how you get along, just you get along. And tell me the story and how you met and how you guys started adventuring together. And then they give you all that information back. You take their choices and their information and their desires, and then you design your campaign and your adventures around that. You could have a large, overreaching arc story ahead of time, but then you go back through and revise it so everything matches up to the choices and expectations that the players have. So you had this story about a giant barbarian group that was going to go into a valley and exterminate all of the goblins, and you're going to help the goblins not have an issue of genocide. And the local human king really would like to see all the goblins go, but the elves said that genocide is just absolutely awful and they want you to intercede. And okay, now they're all going to play clerics. Well, I could then alter the story enough where the church that the clerics are from is also trying to support not having the goblins exterminated. Maybe they're all going to play wizards. Maybe the wizards have been trading with the goblins for some specific herbs that they use in their alchemy and stuff, and they don't want the goblins wiped out. Maybe they're all going to play thieves. Well, the Thieves Guild has been trading with the goblins for decades, and they don't want their allies to be eliminated, and so forth and so forth. You don't have to change your story or your vision that you had. You just need to tailor it and tuck and nip and size things out to accommodate what they're planning on doing. especially if two of them are going to be orcs and one of them is going to be a goblin and one of them is going to be a werewolf or something. Doesn't matter. But you have to have the flexibility enough to tailor the campaign then to that information that they've given you. And if you can work in their backstory into that, all the better. Which brings us to the issue, the second half of the first rule, which is trust. Without trust, and knowing what everybody's responsibilities are, you'll spend a lot of time arguing. And that's just kind of how it boils out. And you need to trust the DM, when you're a player, that the DM has the player's best interests at heart. As the DM, you need to trust that your players aren't going to be your enemy and that they understand that that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to give them the big adventure. You're trying to give them the epic story. They have to trust you that everything that you do, whether you're fudging dice rolls or you're letting them automatically succeed at something or automatically fail at something, that it's to build that grand sense of adventure. So it's really kind of important to have that relationship of trust. And we'll go over some reasons for that and some ideas around that. But it's very important. You really need to have a good sense of trust. And when you're younger, rule mongering is a pain in the ass. When you're older, it tends to get better. Most people have an understanding of that now, rather than when you're younger. But they'll be like, I have to do a dex check, and the DC in the book says this is a DC 12, and I rolled a 13, and I'm telling you as the DM, you failed it. Now, when people rule monger, that tends to show that there's a lack of trust. They should trust the DM that you failed that for a reason. And the reason isn't to punish the character, but it might be there to position the character so they can do something extraordinary. So and it takes time, and your couple adventures will really kind of work that out over time. Players need to trust the DM, but dice will be fudged, rules will be bent, but players need to trust the DM that those actions are to drive the story and shape the adventure, and those alterations will not punish the player. You may have to put players in certain situations, and you may have to fudge or completely ignore rules or issues to put them in the positions that you want them, but the reason that you're putting them there is so they can succeed. You're never going to put them in a situation where they're automatically going to fail, especially if you've deprived them of the opportunity to avoid that altogether. And again, the great example that comes up a lot is the floor gives way and there's a spike trap down below. The player falls down there and is now trapped in the pit. You don't have him impaled on the spikes and you're dead. And, well, he has a really high dexterity. He could have made a dex check to avoid that. He says, well, no, because I need to put him down there because he's going to find something down there in the pit. And there'll be a gelatinous cube down there that he's going to have to run away from because I know he's not equipped to beat it. So the players up above have to frantically try to get him out, and he's going to get out at the last minute. The question is to give the players enough room to work in there on how to get him out of there. They're going to get him out of there one way or the other. The question is to give them the freedom on how to figure out how to get him out of there before he's melted by a giant gelatinous blob. So, and they need to trust the DM and understand that the DM may do that from time to time to build a sense of adventure, to build a sense of overcoming adversity, and to be able to position people where they need to be. And they just need to understand that they're never going to be punished for that. The players should work with the DM to create the story, not work against the story. And you'll get, when you start out, there's always going to be one asshole that is going to be the most uncooperative prick in the world. And here's what you do. You don't invite him to the next session. Just kick his ass out the door and forget about him. Because those type of people thrive. They're like internet trolls. They thrive on being difficult. They thrive on fucking everybody else up. They thrive on making everybody else miserable and not have a good time, and you just get rid of them right off the bat. It's a cooperative activity. It's not an adversarial activity. And if it's the one guy that doesn't want to help his team or doesn't want to make other people at the table have a good time, get rid of them. Just get rid of them. Plain and simple. Because they will spend the entire campaign and adventure making everybody else at the table miserable. So, the idea is that the heroes or villains, depending on the alignment, are the center of the story, and they're the epic heroes and larger-than-life characters, and they need to understand, and the DM should be working towards making that fantasy fulfillment come true. And sometimes you got to knock people down a couple pegs in order to build them up. You might have somebody fall off a cliff and shatter every bone in their body and spend 6 months recovering and recuperating, and they're all penalized on stats and stuff like that. And then you build them up, and they need to trust the DM that they've knocked them down those pegs so they can have this grand adventure getting back up. And you'll build trust with your players over time. And so you have to go easy early on and be very kind of rule-centric until they're comfortable with you. And then you can start bending and working and being more flexible to build the adventure. So you'll start very straight and narrow, and then you'll kind of work a little bit more flexible to build up or knock down people and put them where they need to be in order to have a good experience. But again, as the DM at the heart, you are there to make these characters feel awesome. It's that simple. One thing that's come up with computers and computer games in general, and in more classic role-playing, side quests cause more confusion than they help. You do not need a campaign, and if I were to describe it as a tree with a lot of branches. It's okay to have multiple paths, but they should all lead to the same kind of flow of the story. You don't want dead ends. You don't want, you're in a town and you're trying to find the gem of incredible power, and it's in a cave and you're trying to figure out where the cave is. There's no point in just throwing out, "Hi, my dog's missing. Can you help me find my dog?" No, you just don't do that. It causes more confusion, it kills time, and it just adds busy work, and it doesn't really help. Now, if helping the girl is involved in finding that gem, that's fine. You can have multiple ways to get to the same point. There's no problem with having multiple lines of getting to the end. And it's not so bad when you have different endings to an adventure. You could have a success or failure, or several different multiple endings in video games are a great example. You can have multiple endings to your adventure. You just don't want to have stuff in the middle sticking out in the middle of nowhere for no reason. So it should always end up at the conclusion. You can have different conclusions, but nothing sticking off the side, so to speak. And again, if you have things happening like that, it should always lead into the next plot point. You should never really have to try to have a branch or a couple different options where one is a dead end that results in the plot going nowhere. Even if all of the characters die, your campaign doesn't necessarily have to end. You should always have a contingency on what happens when everybody dies per adventure. So a lot of times it's a house rule. Mine in general has always been, you can create new characters. They will have the exact same experience as your deceased characters, and you can have 10% of whatever your old character's net worth was to start out with, and then have a contingency for bringing in new characters. And we'll get to that later when we talk about planning, but effectively there's 2 entry points to an adventure: existing characters, new characters. Then you have at least 2 exit points to that adventure. They succeed, they fail. And then you could have another one that says they fail hard and they're all dead. But that's kind of the general way that a lot of adventures should be kind of structured is, okay, what happens if these are the existing characters and they're doing okay? What happens if they've wiped out the last adventure and now we got these new guys coming in? You should have a mechanism or a storyline behind that. Anonymous and reactionary rolls will be rolled by the DM for players or ignored as needed for the plot, but the player should be told explicitly that automatically failed rolls for the purpose of plot will not kill or otherwise punish players. Again, we've already kind of covered this. We just want to go over it one more time here. Is that, again, that spike trap that opens up where the player falls down. You should never be having them fall to their death if you're doing the roll as the DM. The DM role, or even ignoring the roll for that matter, should be to be putting players where they need to be, not for killing them. Remember, DMs don't kill people, players and dice do. If there's an automatically failing spike trap, something that is inescapable, it's the whole goddamn hallway, for instance, and they fall and they take a point or two damage, and it's for the plot to find a small passageway or something, that's fine. You don't have to have them roll that. You can just tell them, hey, you guys all failed. It gives way and you guys fall down and you barely miss the spikes on the ground and you only take a point or two damage. If they only have one hit point left, that's not okay. That's the guy that's still at the ledge, and that's why I don't like maps, is that I can position people dynamically where they need to be. So if one of their characters only has one hit point, he's the lucky guy. Holy crap, I didn't fall down there and take that one extra point of damage that would have knocked me out or made me start bleeding. So you don't want to do that. And it's just outright wrong, again, to kill the player or break their legs or something like that. But if a circumstance like that is needed, where you need a high drama point, again, we'll use the spike trap thing, where somebody might get injured and to put people at risk, then you should be letting the players make their saving throws and rolls on their own. You should not be doing those kind of dice rolls automatically. If there's a real legitimate risk of characters being put into a position where they can't recover, then the players should always have control of those dice. And part of the advantage of this is if you're telling them to roll those type of saves, they know the issue is serious, which is a very effective tool. When you're doing all the miscellaneous and kind of somewhat inconsequential rolls, they understand that those are kind of inconsequential rolls and it's for the sake of story and that's fine. When you suddenly shift and tell them to start rolling, they know shit just got real. So that's an advantage, not a disadvantage. And again, the DM needs to trust players, which we're going to cover here on the next slide. But again, it's that trust in what those circumstances are. The DM needs to be confident that the players understand the expectations of them, that they're there to contribute to the story as well. The DM needs to trust the players to contribute to the adventure and take an active role in bringing the world of characters to life. I tell you this, good players are hard to find. I hate to break it to you, but good players are hard to find. So are good DMs. And the reason is because the players want to be catered to. Like you're some kind of waiter or something serving them an adventure, and that's really not what's going on. They have their reaction and their involvement in the campaign and the adventure is just as much for the DM's entertainment as it is for anybody else's. So they need to understand that and make it a collaborative. One of the greatest things when you get a good group of people with a good DM and good players, you make role-playing a spectator event. People will actually sit around your table and just watch you guys play like they would watch a TV show or a movie. And that's when you know you've really got a good group of people, is when spectators start saying this is a good time. And you'll see that at some Dragon Cons and things like that, even to a degree when Penny Arcade guys did it, is if you got a good group and you know the expectations and everybody gets along and everybody knows what they're doing, then it's fun to watch, just like a television show. It's almost like Whose Line Is It Anyway, that TV show, except it's Lord of the Rings kind of a Whose Line Is It. So it works out very well. But you can tell you this, especially if you're young and you're starting out, it can take a decade to really get that groove going. And it's a great experience moving along. And you will have good players and bad players, good DMs and bad DMs. And the best thing I can say is get out there and have a good time suffering through some of the worst DMs and players that you're ever going to have. You gotta find the silver lining in it. Some people are so bad at it, it's funny. So just work with it and enjoy what you can. And again, we kind of keep going over this general idea, but again, it's a collaborative work. It's everybody comes together to make it fun. It's not the DM's job to make it fun. It's not the player's job to make it fun. It's everybody's job to make it fun. And again, the DM is only providing the framework and the skeleton to this. It's up for the players to really kind of finish it out. So that's basically the golden rule.